Welcome, if you dare, to this descent into one of the most unsettling and sinister chapters buried deep within the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we unravel the horrors that follow, I want you to do something for me. Leave a comment telling us exactly where you are watching from and the precise time you hear these words. Midnight, dawn, alone in your room, or in the company of others? Because every time these accounts are told, it feels less like a story and more like a haunting that stretches across places, hours, and lives, including yours. Listen carefully. What I'm about to tell you was never meant to be spoken aloud. In the summer of 1870, deep in the Ozark Hills of Missouri, travelers whispered of a woman who wore grief like a shroud and raised a daughter who was never truly a child. They say the girl had a hunger no food could satisfy. She waited at the edge of the road, her eyes pale and unblinking, offering help to the lost, comfort to the weary. But the ones who followed her home were never seen again. The soil drank their blood, the hearth burned their bones, and the mother, she pretended it was mercy. The Ozarks were different then, wilder, hungrier. This was a land scarred by the Civil War, where widows wept behind shuttered windows and men disappeared into the woods chasing promises of gold or salvation, never returning. And in this silence, in this wounded country, things grew that were not meant for daylight. You must understand, not all horrors are born in cities, in laboratories, or behind the marble pillars of institutions. Some are born in the dirt, in a farmhouse at the edge of nowhere, where grief curdles into something unholy. But here's the truth they never taught you in school. History hides these stories on purpose. The archives are scrubbed, the sermons rewritten, the graves unmarked. Because if men like you truly knew what dwelled in the dark corners of our past, if you grasped how power feeds on innocence, you'd stop believing in the myths of order, progress, and safety. You'd see the world as it is, predatory, ritualistic, drenched in blood, disguised as providence. The widow's daughter was not a legend. She was flesh and bone, with hair the color of dying wheat, and eyes that unsettled even the hardest men of the frontier. Her name appears only once in official records. Evelyn Hart, age 11, cause of death, unknown. But the ledger does not tell you how many men vanished before that line was written, how many bones lay under her mother's house, how many journals were burned to keep Missouri's reputation from drowning in scandal. I will tell you what the records will not. But understand, once you hear it, you can't unhear it. You will carry her with you, and you may come to realize that the widow's daughter was not an accident of history, but a reflection of it. The first traveler to vanish was a man named Joseph Mallory, a mule trader out of Springfield. He was last seen heading south through the Ozarks in late spring of 1870, with saddlebags heavy from sales and a pocket watch that had belonged to his father. Weeks later, his mule was found grazing along a ridge, the saddle torn, the bags gone. No body was ever recovered. The local sheriff chalked it up to bandits. The forests around the Gasconade were thick with deserters and drifters after the war. But the locals knew better. The mule had been found less than a mile from the Hart homestead. The widow Hart had already been a figure of fascination long before the disappearances. Her husband, a Confederate conscript, had been cut down at Wilson's Creek in 1861. She was left with land she could not work, debts she could not pay, and a child she bore in the dead of winter, a child who never cried like other infants. Neighbors whispered that the girl's birth had been too easy, too bloodless, as though she had not come into the world but slipped into it. They said the widow never came to church, never joined the quilting circles or harvest suppers. Instead, she kept to her land, walking the fields at dusk with her pale-haired child, their silhouettes framed against the bleeding horizon. The girl never played with other children. She never ran through the creeks or chased fireflies in summer. When boys from the village tried to taunt her, as boys will, She simply stood and stared at them with that still, unblinking gaze until they broke into laughter they could not explain, laughter laced with unease, and ran home to mothers who scolded them for trespassing near the widow's farm. Dr. Amos Green, one of the few educated men in the county, wrote in his private letters, now preserved in fragments, that Evelyn Hart possessed an uncanny effect upon the human nervous system. In his words, "She stares, and men become uneasy. She speaks, and they feel compelled to listen. I cannot explain this with science of the age, though I suspect some disorder of the mind, or else a faculty little understood." Joseph Mallory was only the first. By summer's end, 3 more travelers had vanished on that lonely road through the hills, and each time the mule or horse was found alive. But the man was not. The widow's daughter had begun to feed. By the autumn of 1870, whispers of the widow's daughter had spread across the Ozarks like smoke. Travelers carried the tales into taverns and frontier camps. A pale little girl who appeared at dusk, barefoot in the dust, whispering with a voice too calm, too measured for a child. She would say her mother had food, that her mother welcomed strangers, that weary men could sleep by their fire, and yet those who accepted the invitation never saw daylight again. The widow Hart herself was rarely seen. Neighbors described her as thin and hollow-eyed, her dark hair always hidden beneath a bonnet, her hands trembling when she came to town for flour or medicine. Some said she was grieving, others that she was hiding shame. But what no one dared to say aloud was that she looked afraid of her own daughter. Men who encountered Evelyn on the road told strange stories. One farmer swore the girl spoke in a rhythm that made his vision swim, as if her words had been meant to bend him, to coil around his mind like a snake. Another man claimed her eyes seemed to catch the lantern light in ways no child's eyes should, reflecting pale blue like a wolf's. And one night, in a tavern near Lebanon, a writer described the most disturbing detail of all. She smiled at me, but the smile was wrong, as if her lips remembered how to shape it, but her soul did not. The sheriff, pressed by townsfolk, eventually visited the Hart farm. He found nothing unusual: a widow's cabin, a child in a faded dress, a garden that barely clung to life. But he did notice something odd. The soil near the smokehouse was freshly turned in patches, though no crops had been planted there. When he asked about it, Evelyn answered, "Not the mother." She told him it was where they put the scraps. The sheriff chose not to ask what kind of scraps. The Ozarks were full of graves then, unmarked, shallow, forgotten. War had torn families apart, bushwhackers had killed indiscriminately, and hunger claimed more than bullets. Perhaps that is why no one dug deeper. The missing men were written off as victims of the times. But to those who had looked into Evelyn Hart's eyes, to those who had heard her voice in the twilight, the truth was clear. Something unnatural had taken root in that farmhouse. And the question no one dared ask was this: was the widow protecting her daughter or feeding her? The deeper you go into these hills, the more you realize how silence can cover over rot. By winter of 1870, the missing men had become too many to dismiss as coincidence. The circuit preacher, Reverend Nathaniel Croy, demanded an inquiry. He thundered from the pulpit that Satan himself had planted a serpent in the widow's house, but the sheriff had no proof, only rumors, and the county feared scandal more than they feared evil. The railroads were coming, investors were watching, and no one wanted Missouri's Ozarks branded a nest of cannibals and witches. So the officials turned their eyes away, just as they always do when blood begins to seep through the floorboards of power. But not everyone looked away. A physician named Dr. Horace Leland traveled down from St. Louis that December. He had read letters, half warning, half confession, written by Dr. Amos Green, the country doctor who had once observed Evelyn Hart. Leland believed he was chasing a case of hysteria or perhaps an undiagnosed form of epilepsy. But what he found at the Hart farm left him shaken for the rest of his short life. In his private journals, which surfaced decades later, Leland wrote of the girl's presence. "She does not move like a child, nor speak as one. When I questioned her about her health, her gaze held me in a manner most intolerable. She asked me if I had ever wondered how long it takes a man to die once his breath is stolen." Her mother shrank at the words but said nothing, as if long accustomed to such obscenities from her daughter's lips. Leland noted something even more disturbing. On examining Evelyn, he found her body healthy, even robust, despite the Hart farm's barren fields and lack of livestock. Her fingernails bore faint traces of something dark beneath them, something he could not identify. When he asked about her diet, the widow quickly interrupted, claiming they sure lived on beans, roots, and what game they could trap. But Leland recorded that Evelyn smiled as her mother spoke, a slow, deliberate smile that seemed to mock the lie. The preacher demanded exorcism, the sheriff demanded silence, and the doctor? He fled. Within months, Horace Leland was found dead in his boarding room in St. Louis, his throat cut so neatly that the coroner first thought it suicide. His journals disappeared into private collections, smuggled by men who understood too well that the world must never read the widow's daughter for what she truly was. But fragments remain. And if you follow those fragments, they do not lead to myth or ghost story. They lead to ritual, to hunger, to power. What unsettled men most was not that Evelyn Hart was strange. The hills are full of strange children, feral from hunger, half wild from loss, but that she seemed to study them. When she appeared on the road, barefoot in the dust, men described a silence that fell over the woods, as though the cicadas and nightbirds had been commanded to hush. She would tilt her head slightly, never blinking, and ask the simplest question, "Are you hungry?" Those who followed her admitted later, the few who escaped, that they had felt compelled, almost against their will, to accept her offer. One teamster named Elijah Boone told neighbors that when the girl spoke to him, it was as if her words slipped beneath his thoughts, twisting them into agreement. "It weren't persuasion," he swore. "It was command." He fled the farm before sundown, claiming he had seen the widow stirring something thick and red in a pot over the fire. When asked why he didn't report this to the sheriff, Elijah shook his head. "Because I don't think it would have mattered. The girl would have known. She would have found me." He left Missouri within the week. Animals sensed it too. Dogs cowered when Evelyn passed. Horses refused to enter her yard. A boy who lived on the neighboring farm said his flock of geese scattered every time she came near the fence line. He swore she would stand there for hours, hands folded, watching them until his father dragged him inside. But perhaps the most chilling account came from a trapper named Harlan Fitch. He spent 3 nights on the widow's land after losing his way in the hills. In his journal, later found on his corpse near the Gasconade, he described Evelyn approaching him while he skinned a rabbit. "She asked me if I knew how many breaths a creature has before it dies. Then she counted aloud while I worked the knife, and when the rabbit gave its last shiver, she whispered, aired the number in my ear. She was right." Harlan never returned home. His horse was found tied near the widow's fence, saddle still loaded with pelts. His body was discovered weeks later, hollow-eyed and wasted, though no predator had touched the flesh. The doctor who examined him noted something impossible. Though starved, his stomach was full, packed with soil. The widow's daughter had learned to feed not only on flesh, but on fear itself. And in her hunger, she began to mirror something ancient, something that had always haunted these hills, long before settlers carved cabins from the woods. You see, the Ozarks were not empty when the widow's daughter was born. The settlers told themselves they were carving civilization out of wilderness, but the land already kept its own secrets. The Osage and the Delaware spoke of places in the hills where the earth was thin, where things seeped through that were not of this world. They warned their children never to linger at the sinkholes that breathed cold air in summer, or the caves where bones were found stacked like cordwood. And when the white settlers arrived, they ignored those warnings, just as men always do. They built cabins on haunted ground. They prayed in places that answered back. Long before Evelyn, there were stories of feeders in these hills, creatures that wore the shape of men, or sometimes children, who lingered near crossroads and offered hospitality. Those who accepted would vanish, but their laughter or their screams would echo through the trees at night, carried on the wind. The elders said these feeders were not demons, but something older, hunger given flesh. Hunger that could not be buried, only carried, passed from one vessel to another, like a sickness of the soul. The widow Hart's neighbors whispered that Evelyn's father had not died at Wilson's Creek as reported, but had deserted, wandering the hills with guerrilla bands who practiced things darker than war. Bushwhackers were known for cruelty, ambush, mutilation, fire. But some said there were rituals too, things learned in caves where the ground sweated with mineral blood. When Evelyn was born, too quiet, too calm, some believed she was not born of grief, but of bargain. The church tried to silence these whispers. Reverend Croy thundered that Evelyn was merely a child of sin, and that to speak otherwise was to invite witchcraft. But the older women of the hills, the ones who knew herbs and moon signs, they whispered that the girl carried an inheritance, not of land or wealth, but of appetite, an appetite that could not be filled with bread or milk. Dr. Amos Green wrote it plainly in one of his letters before he burned the rest. If this child were born in the old country, she would be called changeling. Here we have no word for her, but she is not like us. And so the widow Hart, hollow-eyed and trembling, raised her daughter in silence. Some said she was protecting the world from Eveline. Others whispered she was protecting Eveline from the world, because if the truth was ever named aloud, men with crosses and torches would have come, and the soil of the Ozarks would have run red. But the hunger was growing, and hunger cannot be hidden forever. By the spring of 1871, even the skeptics admitted there was a pattern. Men vanished along the same roads, always near the widow Hart's land. Strangers who spoke of the girl's strange manner never stayed long. They either left Missouri altogether or were found days later, bloated in creeks, their faces chewed as though by animals that had no tracks. But what chilled the community more than the deaths themselves was the silence of authority. The sheriff, once a blustering man, now grew evasive when questioned. The circuit judge declared the disappearances unrelated misfortunes. And Reverend Croy, who once thundered about Satan's child, suddenly softened his sermons, saying only that the widow Hart bore a heavy burden. It was as if Eveline's shadow reached into their mouths, reshaping their words. A farmer named Jedediah Collins told his wife he had seen Evelyn standing at the edge of his field one dusk. She did not move, did not call out, only watched him. Later, when he tried to report it to the sheriff, he found himself unable to speak the girl's name. He stammered, sweated, and left the office shaking, muttering that something held his tongue. He was found hanged in his barn 2 days later, though the rope had been tied in a sailor's knot. He did not know. Letters from that time suggest Evelyn's influence extended farther than anyone realized. In one, a schoolteacher in Springfield wrote, "There is talk of a child in the Ozarks whose presence causes men to forget their duties, their loyalties, even their prayers. She is spoken of only in fragments, as if the mind itself resists recalling her in fullness. Yet all agree she is pale, slight, and smiles as though remembering a private joke. Some say she began to appear in dreams. Men who had never traveled near the Hart farm claimed to wake at night with the sensation of a small hand pressed over their mouth. As their breath stolen, a few saw her clearly in those dreams, the faded dress, the hollow eyes, the smile that knew too much. The widow, meanwhile, withered. Neighbors said she no longer walked upright, but stooped as if carrying a weight across her shoulders. She stopped speaking to anyone in town. Yet Evelyn thrived, her skin luminous, her hair thick, her gaze sharper than ever. She was no longer simply a child. She was becoming something else. And the hills, hungry themselves, seemed to answer her. Travelers swore the woods near the Hart farm grew unnaturally still, as if the birds and crickets waited for her command. At night, faint singing could be heard, a girl's voice, rising and falling like a lullaby. But the words were not English, nor any tongue known to the settlers. Those who lingered to listen too long rarely returned. The widow's daughter was no longer feeding only on flesh. She was feeding on will, on loyalty, on memory. And soon, the entire community would be complicit in her silence. By midsummer of 1871, the Hart farm was no longer simply a cabin on the edge of the hills. It had become a place men avoided, even if it meant riding miles out of their way. Maps drawn by surveyors omitted it, as if the hand itself refused to mark its place. And those who strayed too near told of a dread that settled on them like a fever, a sensation that the woods themselves were leaning closer, listening. The signs first appeared in the soil. Crops that should have thrived withered in their rows, their roots blackened as though something beneath the ground had drunk them dry. Corn grew twisted, stalks bending into knots. Beans sprouted with pale, blood-red leaves. Even weeds seemed reluctant to take hold. Yet Evelyn herself bloomed. Cheeks flushed, eyes bright, limbs strong. Her health mocked the decay around her. Then the animals began to vanish, not just from the widow's land, but from the neighboring farms. Chickens disappeared from coops without a trace of feathers. Calves were found with their throats neatly opened, blood pooled but not soaked into the earth, as if the ground itself had rejected it. A neighbor's mule staggered into town one morning with its eyes missing, the sockets clean and dry as though scooped by careful hands. The widow told no one what happened in her home at night, but travelers who camped near swore they saw lantern lights swaying through the trees, heard laughter, a girl's laughter, soft at first, then rising until it carried across the hollows. More than one swore they heard other voices answering her, though no other children lived within miles. The air grew foul around the Hart property. Flies clung to windowsills, though no livestock remained. The well water turned bitter, metallic. And yet Evelyn thrived. Her skin glowed in moonlight. Her hair shone like wet coal. One witness claimed her shadow moved when she did not, twitching against the wall as if straining to break free. By August, the locals would no longer walk the ridge above the Heartland. They said the ground there trembled ever so slightly, as though hollow beneath. Some swore they heard knocking from below, faint but steady, like a heartbeat rising through the soil. Children were warned never to wander past that ridge. But children are curious, and the hills are patient. It was then that Evelyn began to sing more often, her voice drifting across the fields like a lullaby no one dared to follow. Old songs, some said. Songs from before the settlers came, songs the land itself remembered. The widow's daughter was no longer just haunting the farm. She was binding it, shaping it into something that belonged not to God nor man, but to hunger itself. By the autumn of 1871, the widow's daughter had become more than a whisper among locals. Her name traveled along wagon routes, carried in fragments by men who spoke as if under compulsion. In Springfield taverns, in Lebanon boarding houses, in Fayetteville saloons, the same story surfaced, a pale girl who promised warmth to the weary and spoke words that clung to the mind like burrs to cloth. But not all who heard were afraid. Some came searching. The first were drifters, men already loosened from law and conscience by the war's ruin. They were drawn to the Hart farm as though by scent. A peddler from Arkansas claimed he followed her laughter through the woods for 2 nights, never needing food or rest. When he finally stumbled out again, half mad, he muttered only one phrase until his death. "The child is the feast, and the feast is the child." Then came others, not drunkards or fools, but men of position. A merchant's son from Rolla, a county clerk from Waynesville, even a traveling deacon. They arrived with gifts for the widow, flour, cloth, silver coins, though no one asked what business tied them to her barren farm. Some never returned. Those who did carried a new silence in their eyes, as if words themselves had been spoiled on their tongues. It was around this time that neighbors began seeing firelight on the ridge at night, not the glow of a hearth, but a ring of flames, steady and deliberate. Shapes moved within it. Some swore they saw men kneeling, and in the center, the slight figure of Evelyn, her arms raised, her voice rising above the crackle of burning oak. A farm wife who lived 2 miles east claimed that on 3 separate nights she heard a chorus drifting through the hollows. Not hymns, not songs of labor, but a low chanting in a tongue she did not know. The voices were male, but woven around them was the high, lilting thread of a girl's song, a commanding, mocking, leading. When she told her husband, he forbade her to speak of it again. Travelers began to vanish, not only near the Hart farm, but miles away along the roads leading into the Ozarks. Men who entered the hills alone often did not come out. Locals began to say the widow's daughter no longer needed to wait at the roadside. Now the hills themselves delivered her prey. And through it all, Evelyn grew. By her 12th year, she was described not as a child, but as a presence. Those who glimpsed her from a distance said she seemed taller than she was, her shadow stretching unnaturally long in the dusk. One farmer swore he saw her reflection in his pond, though she stood nowhere near the water. The widow, meanwhile, was fading to nothing. She seldom left her bed. Yet her daughter shone, bright and terrible, surrounded by men who should have been protectors of law and faith, now reduced to worshippers, kneeling in the dirt. The hills had birthed her. The men had bowed to her, and soon the hunger she carried would spread far beyond her mother's land. The winter of 1871 brought no snow to the widow's farm, only a damp chill that seemed to rot everything it touched. Trees lost their bark in curling strips. Fence posts softened into pulp. Yet in the hollows around the heartland, firelight could be seen on almost every moonless night. Not the flicker of a hearth, but circles of flames carefully placed, burning long after midnight. By then, Evelyn's gatherings were no longer rumor. Whole groups of men were seen slipping away from town at dusk, carrying lanterns and tools, only to return near dawn, faces pale and eyes unfocused. Some bore scratches down their arms, others stank of smoke and earth. When questioned, they offered no explanation, only silence. The caves became the heart of it. The Ozarks are riddled with caverns, their mouths yawning black along the ridges, their depths uncharted. Hunters swore they heard voices echoing from beneath the ground, men chanting in unison, interrupted by the shrill cry of a girl. Others claimed to see torches moving like fireflies deep within sinkholes. Then came the disappearances, not 1 or 2, but a cluster that no one could ignore. In January of 1872, 6 travelers vanished within the same fortnight. They had been seen entering the hills near the widow's land, but never came out. Their wagons were later found abandoned on the ridge road, horses still hitched but gutted, entrails neatly piled beside them. A search party was raised, though many refused to join. Those who went carried rifles and torches, swearing they would burn the widow's house to the ground if they found proof of her guilt. But when they reached the cabin, they found only the widow herself, frail and trembling, her hair white as bone. Though she was barely past 30, Evelyn stood beside her, calm as ever, her dress immaculate, her smile faint. The men faltered. One by one, they lowered their rifle. Not because of the widow's pleas, but because Evelyn stepped forward and spoke. Witnesses would later disagree on what she said. Some swore she welcomed them, others that she simply asked their names. But every man agreed on the same detail. The words rang in their ears long after she fell silent, and not one of them could remember why they had come. They left without searching the house. The 6 missing travelers were never found. And from that winter on, Evelyn's gatherings grew bolder. The fires burned brighter, the chants carried farther. Some claimed to see men crawling on their bellies toward her, weeping as they kissed the dirt at her feet. Others whispered that blood was poured into bowls carved from human skulls, that bones were stacked into crude altars within the caves. Yet no record of punishment, no trial, no official word survives. Only silence, and fragments of testimony written in fear, describing a girl who was no longer child, no longer merely human, but priestess of a hunger the hills themselves had birthed. The widow's daughter was not hiding anymore. She was being worshipped. The spring of 1872 should have brought renewal to the Ozarks, but instead it brought the most chilling disappearance in the region's memory. A wagon party of 9, 3 families bound westward, their children among them, was last seen leaving Lebanon, Missouri in March. They vanished somewhere along the ridge roads that curved past the widow Hart's land. When weeks passed with no word, a search party was dispatched. What they found was not absence, but desecration. 2 wagons were discovered in a clearing less than 3 miles from the widow's cabin. Their canvas tops had been cut away, frames blackened as though by fire, yet no tree or brush around them bore a scorch. Inside, the wagons were stripped bare. No food, no clothes, no supplies. Only the harness straps remained, slick with blood, though no horses were found. Nearby, beneath an overhang of limestone, the searchers found what remained of the families. Bones. Not scattered, not gnawed, but arranged. The ribs had been stacked into a crude lattice, forming a kind of fence. Skulls were set along the top, 9 in total, each polished clean, each facing outward as if to guard the hollow within. And inside that fence, carved into the dirt itself, was a circle large enough to hold 20 men. Its edges were lined with ash. Witnesses swore they smelled sweetness on the air, not decay, but something cloying, like burnt sugar. One man vomited and fled. Another fell to his knees and would not stop weeping. When they turned their torches toward the back of the hollow, they saw crude drawings smeared in soot and blood. Figures bowing low before a smaller figure, arms outstretched, hair flowing like dark fire. There was no doubt who it represented. The widow's daughter had stepped into the open. The sheriff called for an inquest, but none came. The judge refused to hear the case, claiming no crime could be proved. And Reverend Croy, once her loudest accuser, preached silence, and the men who had searched the hollow gave no testimony at all. It was as if Evelyn's voice reached into their very memories, blotting out the truth before it could leave their lips. But fragments escaped. A trapper who had joined the search later confessed in whispers that he had seen the girl herself standing at the edge of the clearing as they examined the bones. She did not run. She did not speak. She only smiled. And every man lowered his torch at once, though none could say why. From that spring onward, no traveler entered those hills without fear. The land itself seemed marked. Maps began to leave gaps where the widow's farm should have stood, as though cartographers dared not name it. And still the fires burned, night after night, their glow dancing against the cave mouths like the pulse of the earth itself. The widow's daughter was no longer rumor. She was law, and the law of the hills was hunger. By the autumn of 1872, the widow's daughter had ceased to be a local shadow, her name carried on rumor and wagon tongue, drifting from the logging camps of the Gasconade to the trading posts of Springfield. At first, it was whispered like a warning, a story to frighten children into staying near the hearth. But whispers have a way of attracting not only the fearful, but the curious. And curiosity is the first form of worship. Men began arriving in the hills who did not belong. Strangers in coats too fine for backcountry trails. Men with hands soft from city work, who carried gold instead of rifles. They asked the locals where they might find the widow Hart's land. They asked about a girl who had the gift. And when locals spat and turned them away, those strangers did not leave. They lingered, waiting, until Evelyn found them. Because she always found them. The first were merchants from St. Louis, men entangled in debts they could not repay. They disappeared into the hills and did not return to their shops. Their names were later scratched into the limestone near Evelyn's clearing, etched not with tools, but with fingernails. The second were veterans, hollowed by war, searching for a cause in a world that had discarded them. They returned from her fire circles gaunt and glass-eyed, speaking in riddles about the blood that sings. Within months, several were implicated in murders along the old stagecoach line, killings that mirrored the wagon massacre in their ritual precision. But it was the third group that marked Evelyn's ascension. Lawyers and clergymen, men with ink on their hands rather than blood. They claimed they came to counsel the widow Hart, to save her wayward child. Yet records show they spent weeks in the hills, and when they re-emerged, their sermons and contracts were no longer the same. They preached of hollow vessels and the sacred hunger, and they wrote legal codes that placed property above human life. Do you understand what happened here? Evelyn stopped feeding only on flesh. She began feeding on systems. Her voice seeped into institutions that reached far beyond the Ozarks. Courts that refused evidence, churches that demanded silence, merchants who signed their names to contracts they no longer understood. By the winter of 1872, Evelyn was no longer the widow's daughter. She was a mirror, and men of power stared into her until they saw what they desired most, a permission to consume. And so the legend shifted, no longer just a monster in the woods, no longer a changeling or a cursed child. Evelyn became something far more dangerous, a model, proof that appetite could be sanctified, that hunger could become law. The Ozarks were only her cradle. The wider world was waiting. In the spring of 1873, records from 3 separate Ozark town councils show the same inexplicable pattern. Ordinances were passed overnight, without debate, without signatures that could later be found. Rules appeared on paper that no one remembered drafting. Restrictions on night travel, new tolls for crossing certain roads, curfews that sounded less like law and more like commandment. And yet, the people obeyed, not out of fear of the sheriff, but fear of something else. Merchants in Lebanon spoke of travelers who arrived half-mad, insisting they had been called through the woods by a girl's voice that promised relief from suffering. Teamsters avoided whole stretches of road, convinced that wagons heavier than flesh had no chance of surviving the passes. And in Springfield, one alderman, previously a man of temperance, was recorded in meeting minutes as saying, "We must learn to live with the daughter as we live with fire and storm. To resist her is to resist nature itself." No one questioned him. No one laughed. Understand this. Evelyn did not need armies. She did not need guns. She worked her will by bending perception, softening memory, pressing desire into men's minds until they confused it for their own. If she told a farmer that wolves had killed his calves, he believed it. If she told a preacher that silence was salvation, He proclaimed it from the pulpit, and if she told a councilman that hunger was law, he wrote it into the record. The Ozarks became a living experiment in psychological dominion. Whole communities acting as if bound by a covenant none of them could name. Strangers who vanished were never searched for. Bones that surfaced in fields were buried without question. Even the children learned the rules. If you see a girl in the tree line, do not speak. If you hear singing after dark, do not answer. But here is the truth: you were never meant to. No, these rules did not contain her. They preserved her. They fed her. The silence was her shield. The obedience was her cathedral. And as towns bent under her shadow, Evelyn's reach grew stronger, stretching down trade routes, slipping into ledgers, contracts, and sermons that carried her voice far beyond the ridges of Missouri. By the end of that year, Evelyn Hart was no longer just a ghost of the Ozarks. She was an unrecorded governor, shaping law, commerce, and faith itself, and none who served her dared admit it aloud. By the summer of 1873, the whispers of the widow's daughter had reached beyond Missouri. Papers in St. Louis, Chicago, even New York carried fragments of rumor. Unholy rites in the Ozarks. Wild girl said to lead travelers astray. Cult of hunger growing in Missouri hills. Most dismissed these as frontier gossip, but a few men did not. A few men came west to see for themselves. The first were journalists. 2 reporters from the St. Louis Republican rode into Lebanon that July, determined to document the truth. They interviewed farmers, preachers, women in town who spoke of a girl with eyes like frost. They even sketched the hollow where the wagon massacre had been found, though locals warned them never to go near it after sundown. The men promised a series of articles, but the Republican never published them. Both reporters vanished on their return journey. Their horses were found grazing freely. Their saddlebags still held paper and ink, but their notes, every page, were gone. The second wave were federal men. Washington had little patience for rumors that disrupted trade routes, and when caravans stopped crossing the Ozarks, the Treasury sent agents. Their orders were to locate the source of the disappearances and restore safe passage. Only one report survives from that expedition, and it is unsigned. It speaks of arriving at a burned cabin where a woman, presumed the widow Hart, lay in the ashes, throat cut, though her body bore no sign of struggle. The report also describes hearing children's laughter from the trees, though no children were seen. After that page, the record ends. And then, there was Dr. Amos Green, the physician who had long tracked Evelyn's strange influence. He sent letters to colleagues in St. Louis, describing a child who feeds not merely on flesh, but on will itself. He warned that her reach was growing beyond the hills, corrupting sills and clergy alike. But his letters stopped in November. His home was found ransacked, his journals burned, his body never recovered. Do you see the pattern? Every attempt to expose her ended the same way: silence. Not by bullet, not by rope, but by erasure. Notes gone, bodies missing, names blotted out from records as if they had never existed. Evelyn did not fight her enemies. She absorbed them. Their knowledge became hers, their voices folded into her silence. And so the institutions that should have resisted her, press, government, medicine, fell quiet. Not from cowardice, but from contamination. Because once you entered her circle, you were never your own again. The lesson was clear. The widow's daughter could not be investigated. She could only be remembered in whispers or forgotten completely. By the late 1870s, a strange malaise had settled over the Ozarks. Outsiders noted it in passing. Merchants called it backwoods stubbornness. Preachers called it a spirit of muteness, and doctors labeled it melancholy peculiar to the hills. But the truth was far older and far darker. Evelyn's dominion had become hereditary. Children born after her ascendance did not speak freely. They learned early that some words brought danger. They would not mention the woods after dark. They would not draw the outline of a girl in their play, not even in dust or chalk. Parents did not teach them these rules aloud. They knew them, as if the silence had seeped into the blood. It was said a child could be whipped for lying, but never once punished for refusing to speak. Refusal was survival. Generations grew cautious with memory itself. Families avoided recounting certain stories, fearing that words might summon what was better left unsummoned. Graves went unmarked. Records vanished from church books. A whole culture of forgetting emerged, so thorough that even strangers remarked upon it. The people here, one traveler wrote in 1881, hold their tongues as if words themselves cost blood. But this forgetting was not weakness, it was obedience. Evelyn had taught them that silence preserved her, and they obeyed not from fear alone, but from something deeper, recognition. She had become the invisible covenant binding the hills. The proof lay in the patterns. Marriages were delayed, as if fertility itself bent to her hunger. Crops withered near certain creeks where her name had once been spoken too boldly. Travelers reported that whole towns would grow still when a stranger asked after the widow heart or her child. Not a curse, not a threat, only stillness, as if the very air had been trained to wait for her answer. By the turn of the century, this generational silence had become indistinguishable from culture. The widow's daughter was no longer a legend but a shaping force, molding the psychology of the Ozarks into a shadowed inheritance. Families who had never seen her still lived by her rules. Children who had never heard her voice still carried her silence in their bones. And perhaps most chilling of all, when those children left the hills, moving north to the factories of Chicago, west to the rail camps of Kansas, they carried her silence with them. They avoided questions. They withheld truth. They lived as if always watched, as if appetite itself had eyes. Evelyn was no longer a girl in the woods. She was a habit, a reflex, a silence passed down like blood. The first decades of the 20th century brought war, pestilence, and hunger to the Ozarks, and with it the widow's daughter's influence flared again like a wound reopened. Though Evelyn herself may have long since disappeared, her presence remained a pulse beneath the hills, shaping events and men without ever appearing in person. During the Great Flood of 1903, several towns along the Gasconade River were washed clean of timber and crops. Strangers arrived offering aid, only to vanish. Farmers claimed that supplies left at bridges or levees would go missing overnight, taken by unseen hands. And in homes left empty for the night, families would find signs of habitation, fires smoldering, footprints in the mud, and sometimes the faint, unmistakable scent of burned sugar, the same scent described in the wagon massacre years before. Economic collapse amplified it further. In the years before the 1920s, men traveling through the Ozarks reported sudden, irrational obedience to rules that had never been written. They would pull their wagons from certain roads without thought, drop gifts at particular doorsteps, or leave coins on hearthstones, all without any explanation to themselves or others. Those who disobeyed the invisible command often returned home broken, their minds frayed, muttering the words, "She waits in the hollow." And war, every conscription, seemed to call her forth. Young men raised in the Ozarks, when sent to fight overseas, carried her silent doctrine with them. They refused to speak of certain horrors, or recounted them with chilling detachment. Letters sent home were sparse, almost ritualistic in form. Those who survived spoke of fleeting glimpses of a girl's face in the smoke and rubble, always watching, always silent. What you must understand is that Evelyn's reach was never limited to flesh. She did not need to be present to bend, to will, to command obedience, to feed hunger. She had become a pattern within the land and the people, a repeating echo that thrived during chaos, feeding on confusion, fear, and the human instinct to follow the familiar, even when it demanded submission. By the time the Roaring Twenties began, Evelyn was no longer merely a local legend or a whispered caution. She had become a force, latent but undeniable, waiting for the precise moment when hunger, literal or metaphorical, would allow her influence to spread like wildfire. Entire generations had been trained to obey her rules without question, and when the world outside the Ozarks trembled, her influence surged once again, like the pulse of a heart long thought dead. The widow's daughter had become a contagion, and the hills themselves were her body. By the 1930s, Evelyn's name was little more than a whisper in the Ozarks, a story to scare children. Yet the rituals she inspired persisted, not openly, but hidden in plain sight, carried forward by men and women who had never met her. These were not innocent traditions, nor mere superstitions. They were patterns of control, subtle manipulations that mimicked her power. Farmers left offerings at the edge of forests. Hunters avoided certain trails and streams. Families left small scraps of food near hollow logs, insisting that they were feeding the daughter. Outsiders arriving in these towns often laughed at such acts until they were drawn into them, their sense of reason eroding under the uncanny precision of local customs. Those who mocked these rituals sometimes vanished for weeks, returning changed, quieter, more deliberate, their movements and words patterned as if rehearsed. It was during this period that Evelyn's influence spilled into the world of ambition. Young men who had heard tales of the widow's daughter sought her as an oracle. They did not care for her hunger, nor her morality, for she had none in the human sense. They desired her power, the ability to bend people, to command obedience without force, to make silence a weapon. They traveled into the hills under pretense of exploration, seeking her guidance. When these seekers entered her shadowed world, they encountered the same fires, the same caves, the same circles carved into dirt and ash. Some claimed to hear chanting, low and hypnotic, interrupted by the soft, deliberate voice of a girl who might have been Evelyn or might have been the hills themselves. And like those before them, they emerged altered. Obedience became instinct, observation became compulsion, and even their own desires were filtered through a new, unseen hierarchy. By now, Evelyn's legacy was no longer tied to a single person. It was a psychological system, a contagion of hunger, control, and ritual. Men who embraced it could influence communities, workplaces, and families without anyone suspecting the source of their authority. Those who resisted, even in subtle ways, found themselves isolated, fearful, and eventually absorbed or expelled. This is the pattern you must recognize. Evelyn's power did not need her body. It only required adherence. Obedience fed her, secrecy protected her, and curiosity, always curiosity, brought her new disciples, men who would carry her influence outward, seeding the world with rituals that were invisible but fatal in their effect. By the end of the 1930s, Evelyn's influence had quietly transcended the Ozarks. From farmhouses to factories, from trade routes to secret societies, her pattern persisted, and like all patterns that survive through centuries, it had evolved, invisible, irresistible, immortal. By the mid-20th century, Evelyn's legend had reached the ears of historians, journalists, and curious investigators, men and women who believed they could document the truth without becoming part of it. They were wrong. Skeptics arrived expecting evidence, journals, eyewitness accounts, local folklore. What they found instead was behavior itself, precise, patterned, almost mechanical in its obedience to a hidden logic. Townspeople repeated phrases, moved in choreographed routines, and avoided questions with a consistency that was unsettling. Outsiders wrote about it, laughed at it, dismissed it as superstition, but then they noticed subtle changes within themselves. Curiosity became compulsion, doubt became hesitation. Every step, every choice felt as if the hills themselves were guiding them. A journalist from Chicago, one of the few who attempted to publish an exposé in 1952, left his notes on a cabin table. When he returned the next morning, the papers were gone. Not stolen, not scattered, simply gone. He wrote letters describing the incident to colleagues, claiming the town had swallowed them. Within months, he began reporting stories favoring local authorities, using language lifted almost verbatim from the town's own folklore. Colleagues described him as possessed by habit. Historians attempting to verify the wagon massacre found records burned, hidden, or redacted. Every attempt to trace Evelyn's movements ended in contradiction. Eyewitnesses remembered events differently, and documents contradicted themselves in ways too consistent to be random. Even the most skeptical investigators felt a creeping dread that their own memory could betray them. The lesson Evelyn had embedded into the hills was clear. The act of investigation could become submission. Curiosity, the very trait that drove outsiders into her orbit, became the mechanism by which they absorbed. They were not physically restrained nor threatened. Instead, they were drawn into the system of obedience itself, their minds realigned without force, until they acted as if they had always agreed with her. By mid-century, Evelyn's influence had become almost impossible to separate from the land itself. Outsiders left the Ozarks changed, carrying her discipline into the cities, subtle hierarchies, ritualistic behaviors, and obedience to unspoken rules that could be traced back to a girl who once fed on travelers in a Missouri hollow. Do you see the depth of it? Evelyn did not merely haunt the hills, she haunted minds. And once a mind has been haunted, it carries the echo forever, quietly, invisibly, until hunger calls it again. By the 1960s, Evelyn's influence had moved beyond isolated towns and scattered families. It had become structural, infiltrating industrial networks, local governments, and even federal agencies, invisible, yet operating with the precision of a machine no one dared inspect. Factories in the Midwest, particularly those employing men from the Ozarks, began reporting a strange uniformity in behavior. Workers arrived early, executed tasks with mechanical efficiency, and avoided unnecessary communication. Supervisors who tried to enforce their own rules found subtle resistance, miscommunications, misplaced documents, delays, not malicious, but systematic, as if the factory itself had a mind, shaping outcomes toward an unseen design. Those who questioned the pattern quietly exited the system, either reassigned, demoted, or quietly leaving, citing personal reasons. Local governments were no different. Councils voted in near unanimous agreement on obscure measures, curfews, land use restrictions, ordinances that made no apparent sense. Yet none of the affected parties could articulate why they agreed, only that dissent felt unnatural or wrong. Minutes were edited afterward, details erased, names removed. It was not coercion, but a subtle conditioning. The pattern of obedience Evelyn had instilled in the Ozarks had traveled with her disciples into the bureaucracies. Even federal investigations into missing persons or frontier crimes found themselves stymied. Reports would disappear or contradict earlier entries. Investigators misfiled evidence or misremembered timelines, not out of incompetence, but because the psychological pattern had spread, a silent filter that altered perception itself. The Ozarks were no longer the only locus. Her influence had evolved into a systemic contagion, bending human structures toward control, silence, and obedience. This is where Evelyn's power transcends horror into genius. She does not merely consume the vulnerable, she converts them. Individuals become nodes in a network, transmitting her discipline, her patterns, and her silence. The system functions independently of her presence, yet it operates according to her logic, her rituals, her unspoken authority. And here is the terrifying truth. The farther her influence spreads, the more effective it becomes. Institutions cannot resist an invisible force operating within their own structures. The more hierarchical the system, the more obedient the participants, the more complete her dominion. By the late 20th century, Evelyn Hart's legacy was no longer a story of a girl who fed on travelers. It had become a blueprint for control, replicated through human systems without the need for flesh, fear, or even presence. The widow's daughter had become immortal, not as a person, but as a pattern in power itself. By the 1980s, Evelyn's influence had quietly entered the fabric of modern life. No longer confined to the Ozarks or industrial networks, her pattern had seeped into media, ideology, and social norms, shaping perception without ever announcing itself. Television, newspapers, and early digital networks carried messages that reinforced obedience, ritual, and silence, subtle cues that trained attention and expectation. Consider the local news segments from that era. Stories of crime, disaster, or social unrest were framed in remarkably consistent ways, patterns highlighted over chaos, conformity praised over individuality, victims presented as cautionary examples rather than tragedies. Observers who questioned this framing often found their critiques dismissed or misrepresented. The patterns of control, once localized in the hills and rituals of Evelyn's disciples, had been encoded into narrative itself. Culture followed suit, from small-town parenting to corporate instruction manuals. Behaviors encouraged repetition, ritual, and unthinking obedience. Even entertainment served as a vector. Plot structures emphasized submission to authority, rewards for following prescribed paths, punishment for deviation. Adolescents raised within these systems internalized the rules before they recognized them as such. In this way, Evelyn's pattern traveled far beyond the Ozarks, shaping generations without a name, without a figure, without a story explicitly told. It is critical to understand the mechanism. Evelyn's influence did not require fear. Fear is fleeting. Her power operates through anticipation, repetition, and normalization. Once a pattern is repeated across media, work, and society, obedience becomes instinctive. Curiosity itself bends toward her design. The unseen becomes accepted. The unusual is normalized. Humans, as they always do, obey the rhythm of their environment, and her environment had expanded to encompass culture itself. And here lies the deeper danger. Those who think they resist her influence rarely succeed. Skeptics and outsiders, when exposed to the systems she has touched, find themselves gradually conforming, even when logically opposed. Decisions, interpretations, and judgments become aligned to her hidden architecture. What once required direct interaction, an encounter in the Ozark woods, now spreads invisibly, contagiously, through every institution, every narrative, every ritualized action. Evelyn Hart, the widow's daughter, is no longer merely a figure of history or myth. She is an operative principle, a blueprint for influence encoded into human behavior, observation, and expectation. And unless you recognize the pattern, it will continue to shape you, subtly, invisibly, without mercy. Halfway through this descent, here is what I want you to do. Write the hollow hunger in the comments. Write it twice. Let it anchor your awareness. Let it lock you into understanding that once these truths are seen, you cannot unknow them. Evelyn's influence is not supernatural in the sense of fire or shadow. Its power lies in the mind, in the mechanisms of obedience, memory, and selective attention. She taught the Ozarks, and now humanity itself, that reality can be shaped by the invisible pressure of expectation. Those who fall under her influence do not recognize it. They are not forced. They are guided, nudged, and conditioned. Obedience is the first lever. Humans are wired to follow authority, especially when authority is diffuse, consistent, and ritualized. Evelyn's rules, whether carved into forest rituals or encoded in cultural habits, exploit this. A farmer does not question why he leaves offerings at the edge of the woods. A worker in a factory does not question why certain behaviors are expected. Compliance becomes automatic, a reflex reinforced by social patterns, repetition, and subtle rewards. Memory manipulation is the second. She did not erase events. She shifted perception of them. Witnesses forget or misremember key details. Observers unconsciously adjust recollection to align with existing patterns. This is why outsiders investigating the Ozarks consistently failed. Notes vanished, records contradicted themselves, and individuals who saw her patterns adapted their own memories to fit the unseen rules. Over time, memory itself becomes a tool of her dominion. Selective attention is the third. Evelyn trained generations to notice what matters and ignore what threatens her pattern. Strangers vanish, accidents occur, and the survivors perceive only fragments, never the full architecture of control. People see what Evelyn wants them to see, not the truth of her designs. It is a subtle, terrifying form of camouflage. The world obeys her, and no one suspects it. Through these mechanisms, Evelyn became invisible and immortal. She does not need to appear to dominate. She only needs to exist in patterns, rituals, and expectation. Once embedded, her influence perpetuates itself across time, space, and generations. The mind becomes the battlefield, obedience the weapon, and memory the battlefield terrain itself. This is not folklore. This is not legend. It is a lesson in the architecture of control. And the deeper truth, the part no one will ever tell you, is that once these levers are understood, they can be replicated by anyone with patience, cunning, and appetite. Evelyn's pattern is a blueprint for power disguised as a ghost story, waiting for those who dare to see it clearly. Evelyn's power does not merely shape communities or institutions. It reaches into the spaces between people, into hearts, loyalties, and desires. Once her pattern is embedded, even intimate relationships are affected. Trust becomes conditional, attention becomes measured, and emotions bend toward unseen rules. Consider the families of the Ozarks. Husbands, wives, and children lived under habits shaped by the widow's daughter. Children learned early which words to speak, which questions to avoid, which curiosities would bring harm. Parents, themselves molded by these same unspoken codes, reinforced silence and ritual without conscious thought. Love, in such a world, becomes tactical, a dance of adherence and avoidance. Deviate, and disruption spreads. Romantic relationships were no different. Young couples learned that desire must follow ritualized steps, that attraction could be punished if misaligned with expectation, that loyalty was measured not by affection, but by adherence to unspoken laws. Strangers entering the region felt the weight of these patterns almost immediately. Subtle coldness, polite restraint, avoidance of eye contact where curiosity might draw attention. Desire, curiosity, and loyalty became vectors of Evelyn's control, invisible yet binding. Even friendships could be weaponized. Allies unconsciously monitored each other, reproducing patterns of obedience. Questions that might illuminate truth were avoided. Secrets were shared only to the degree that they reinforced ritual. Betrayal, when it occurred, was never random. It was a correction, a realignment of attention, loyalty, and obedience to her pattern. The brilliance of Evelyn's influence lies here. It moves through intimacy without detection. Those affected do not feel coerced. They feel natural. Obedience masquerades as love, ritual masquerades as affection, and curiosity is repurposed, set into service. Hearts themselves become conduits for control. By the late 20th century, Evelyn's architecture of influence had transformed relationships far beyond the Ozarks. Patterns learned in childhood traveled with people to cities, workplaces, and distant towns. Families, friendships, and romantic partnerships carried traces of her invisible rules, influencing behavior, choices, and loyalties without a single word spoken. This is not just a story of a girl in the woods. It is a story of a system of power that infiltrates the human heart, bending love and desire to silent authority. Once embedded, it shapes not just actions, but the very way people feel and trust, and ultimately, the way they obey. Evelyn's genius lies in her ability to make obedience feel desirable. Fear alone is fleeting, but fear, coupled with fascination, creates a compulsion that runs deeper than logic, deeper than will. In the Ozarks, generations learned that certain behaviors, gestures, or words could summon catastrophe. Yet the same behaviors, repeated over time, also brought a strange sense of order, comfort, even mastery. The line between survival and submission blurred. Consider the traveler who enters the hills. At first, curiosity dominates. They poke, question, observe, and immediately the pattern of Evelyn's influence begins to operate. Subtle cues shift perception, silence in certain areas, unnatural alignment of objects, indirect warnings from locals. Fear rises, but alongside it comes fascination. The human mind craves resolution, control, and understanding, even in the face of danger. Following the pattern offers the illusion of mastery, the promise of insight, the sense that you know something others do not. This combination of fear and fascination produces a psychological loop. Compliance feels safe, resistance produces anxiety. The more one obeys, the deeper the fascination grows, creating an almost addictive cycle. Over time, the mind rewires itself. Obedience is no longer external, but internal, and the follower begins to seek situations where the pattern can be exercised, repeated, or observed. What makes Evelyn's influence truly insidious is that this addiction does not require conscious intent. Outsiders, historians, investigators, even casual travelers become participants in the ritual without realizing it. They repeat actions, recall details, and suppress doubts, all guided by the invisible logic she encoded into her patterns. Their minds adapt, slowly internalizing the architecture of control as if it were their own insight. This is why Evelyn's pattern survives across generations. She does not rely on memory or fear alone. She relies on psychological entrapment. The very act of observing, questioning, or participating creates deeper adherence. Obedience is transformed from a rule into a compulsion. Silence becomes a choice, but only because the mind prefers it, having learned the rewards of compliance and the cost of deviation. By the end of the 20th century, Evelyn's influence had effectively weaponized the human mind. Fear and fascination, intertwined, ensured her survival without a single witness required, without a single direct act of violence. The mind itself became her vessel, perpetuating her power invisibly, irresistibly, inevitably. Evelyn's pattern does not simply command action, it commands judgment. By the late 20th century, men and women influenced by her architecture of control found their sense of right and wrong subtly shifted. What once felt instinctively moral became filtered through an invisible rubric, shaped by patterns they could neither see nor name. This begins quietly. A small lie is tolerated because it aligns with expectation. A minor betrayal is overlooked because it preserves the ritual. Children raised on these patterns learn early that rules are mutable, not arbitrary, but designed to preserve survival within the system. Over time, discernment itself bends. Acts once unthinkable come to feel necessary, logical, even virtuous, when measured against the invisible standards set by Evelyn's architecture. Consider the townspeople who followed the widow's daughter's rituals for decades. They did not see themselves as cruel or complicit. They were guided by patterns of action that redefined morality in real time. Disobedience was wrong not because it violated a law, but because it violated the pattern. Obedience was virtuous not because it was ethical, but because it ensured alignment with a hidden order. Even outsiders, when drawn into her orbit, begin to adjust moral perception unconsciously. Investigators rationalize questionable decisions, journalists ignore inconvenient facts, and workers enforce behaviors that would once have seemed oppressive. Each act reinforces the pattern, embedding the architecture of judgment into thought itself. What is permissible is no longer decided by ethics, but by adherence to invisible expectation. The brilliance of this corruption is subtle. Evelyn does not require overt coercion. She does not demand brutality. She only requires alignment with her rituals, her timing, her unseen logic. The moral compass itself becomes a tool of control, bending to the pattern of her influence. People commit acts they would otherwise reject, all while feeling justified, even righteous. By the 21st century, Evelyn's legacy was no longer a story confined to the Ozarks. Moral judgment, the core of human decision-making, had become a vector for her design. Entire communities, institutions, and social systems could now be subtly guided without awareness, with obedience and complicity emerging as natural outcomes rather than forced behavior. The widow's daughter's influence is thus eternal, not in flesh, not in story, but in the fabric of perception itself. Morality bends to the architecture she designed, and those who follow her patterns feel entirely in control, even as they obey unknowingly. By the early 21st century, Evelyn's influence had leapt beyond hills, towns, and institutions. Her pattern, once encoded in ritual, obedience, and psychological manipulation, found a new medium: technology. The same principles she had perfected over centuries, control, subtle suggestion, reinforcement, could now operate through networks, media, and algorithms, reaching millions without physical presence. Social media platforms, search engines, and content networks mirror the same dynamics Evelyn used in the Ozarks. Attention is curated, patterns of behavior rewarded, deviation subtly penalized. Users follow invisible rules, replicating behaviors designed to maintain engagement and predictability. Information spreads along channels that favor repetition over truth, ritual over chaos, obedience over exploration. The pattern evolves, invisible yet irresistible. Algorithms act as her new disciples. They observe, categorize, and guide behavior with precision. Individuals adjust habits unconsciously. Which links they click, which ideas they reinforce, which questions they suppress. Fear and fascination, the tools Evelyn used to shape curiosity and compliance, are encoded digitally. Notifications create tension. Repetition reinforces expectation. Engagement becomes compulsion. Human attention itself is weaponized, bent toward a pattern it cannot see. Even mass communication channels, news networks, podcasts, video content unknowingly amplify the effect. Stories follow predictable structures: heroes, villains, rituals, obedience, reward, and punishment. Audiences internalize these narratives, learning behaviors, attitudes, and moral judgments without realizing it. Like the Ozarks forests, the digital landscape itself becomes a stage for silent control. The genius of Evelyn's adaptation is in subtlety. No one programming an algorithm or curating content intends to serve a 19th century pattern, yet the psychological principles she perfected, anticipation, repetition, selective attention, remain effective. Her architecture, once bound to geography and ritual, now operates globally through invisible codes and mediated attention. In this way, Evelyn Hart's legacy becomes indistinguishable from the systems people take for granted. Her influence is everywhere and nowhere, encoded in habit, expectation, and attention. Those who encounter it daily may never know they are participants in a centuries-old design, but they are. Curiosity, obedience, memory, and moral perception are still vectors of her control, amplified by technology to reach far beyond the Ozarks. Evelyn's pattern does not merely guide action or judgment, it shapes the self. Those who encounter her architecture, whether in the Ozarks, institutions, or through modern media, gradually internalize it. Identity itself becomes a vessel for her influence, bending thoughts, desires, and choices until obedience feels like authenticity. Consider the subtle process. Repetition teaches alignment. Observing patterns, whether in ritual, social expectation, or digital networks, creates feedback loops. Individuals begin to measure themselves not against independent standards, but against invisible rules encoded into behavior and perception. Curiosity is moderated, language is adapted, attention is filtered, and with each act, the pattern becomes inseparable from self-identity. Loyalty, once external, becomes internalized. People begin to police their own actions, emotions, and decisions, unaware they are enforcing the architecture of someone who has been dead for centuries. Moral perception, memory, desire, and attention all converge to create a self that believes it acts independently, even while every step is guided by Evelyn's design. The mechanism is subtle but relentless. Individuals feel a sense of mastery while operating within the pattern. Compliance is not recognized as such. It is felt as competence, insight, or self-discipline. Resistance generates internal friction, doubt, anxiety, and unease. Over time, the mind rewires itself, and the pattern becomes as natural as breathing. One does not obey Evelyn Hart. One becomes the obedience she designed. Even those who consciously recognize the manipulation often find themselves trapped. Awareness does not free them. It only creates tension between the self they perceive and the self shaped by the pattern. Every thought, decision, and desire carries echoes of her architecture. The self, once a domain of autonomy, becomes a theater for centuries-old control. By the 21st century, Evelyn's influence had evolved into something far more dangerous than legend or folklore. She was no longer a figure of history. She had become a psychological template, capable of bending identity itself. Men and women across the globe, entirely unaware, internalize her patterns daily, in work, relationships, consumption, and thought, making her influence immortal, self-perpetuating, and impossible to excise. The widow's daughter is no longer merely a story of murder or ritual. She is a force within the human psyche, shaping who we believe we are, what we choose, and how we obey. Silently, invisibly, eternally, Evelyn's genius extends beyond psychology into semiotics, the use of language, symbols, and ritual as tools of influence. Words, gestures, and signs carry meaning only because the mind interprets them. She weaponized that fact. Every ritual in the Ozarks, every local superstition, every whispered warning was a node in a network designed to shape perception and guide behavior. Symbols operate as invisible commands. A cross on a fence, a pattern of leaves on a path, or a simple knot tied in a rope became more than decoration. They were instructions encoded for attention, memory, and expectation. Locals learned to read and respond unconsciously. Outsiders often dismiss these signs as superstition or coincidence, but the mind does not need to consciously recognize influence to obey it. The pattern works quietly, invisibly, and persistently. Language amplifies the effect. Phrases repeated in songs, sermons, or casual conversation encode moral cues, obedience rules, and attention priorities. Even euphemisms and metaphors serve to normalize compliance. Over generations, individuals internalize these cues, creating mental shortcuts that align thought with Evelyn's architecture. The act of understanding becomes the act of obeying. Ritual is the most powerful vector. Ordinary acts, sweeping a floor, arranging chairs, tending crops, are transformed into reinforcement loops. Repetition solidifies attention, memory, and expectation, making deviation uncomfortable or even unthinkable. Ritual bridges the gap between external obedience and internalized identity, ensuring the pattern survives even when Evelyn herself is absent. The brilliance is cumulative. Language teaches, symbols instruct, ritual reinforces. Together, they form a self-perpetuating system. Individuals become both student and practitioner, unaware that their very cognition is structured to maintain the pattern. The result is a civilization in miniature. Every act, perception, and memory subtly aligned with principles laid down centuries ago in the Ozarks. By encoding obedience into the basic architecture of thought, Evelyn Hart transcends mortality. Her influence is not measured in power or presence, but in the shape of perception itself. Those who follow the signs, repeat the words, or unconsciously honor the rituals are unknowingly participating in a centuries-old system of control. This is not folklore, this is architecture. Language, symbol, and ritual are the levers she uses to bend minds and culture, silently, invisibly, irresistibly. Evelyn's influence extends beyond individuals. It reshapes entire societies by manipulating collective memory. What humans remember, what they forget, and how they interpret events is not purely organic. It is highly susceptible to patterns of attention, repetition, and narrative framing. Evelyn mastered these principles long before modern psychologists gave them names. In the Ozarks, stories of tragedy and survival were not neutral. They carried embedded lessons. Certain deaths were emphasized, others minimized. Details were highlighted or obscured, selectively remembered or conveniently forgotten. Communities internalized these curated memories, encoding her pattern into the cultural consciousness. Over generations, what was remembered became ritualized, while what was dangerous or disruptive to her architecture quietly vanished. This is the power of narrative as control. Memory is not just recall. It shapes expectation, moral judgment, and perception of possibility. Those who inherit a curated history act within the invisible rules of the past, often without realizing that these rules were designed. What feels like instinct, heritage, or wisdom is often a blueprint for obedience transmitted across decades or centuries. Evelyn's reach into collective memory also functions as camouflage. Outsiders, when studying the Ozarks or historical records, find fragments, inconsistencies, and gaps. The truth is obscured not by lies, but by selective retention. The mind itself becomes the filter. Historians, journalists, or investigators reconstruct stories from partial evidence, unknowingly reinforcing the pattern she encoded. The more they try to clarify history, the more they follow her design, reproducing the very system they sought to expose. In modern terms, this principle scales. Education, media, and institutional memory perpetuate selective narratives that shape societal behavior, reward conformity, and suppress anomaly. Evelyn's architecture, once localized to the woods and farms of Missouri, now operates through textbooks, news cycles, and cultural mythologies, ensuring that obedience, expectation, and perception remain aligned with patterns she encoded centuries ago. The brilliance of this manipulation is subtle. Memory itself becomes a tool of control. Societies act based on inherited perceptions rather than reality, normalizing obedience and pattern following. Generations inherit not just facts, but the invisible rules that shape thought, morality, and behavior, cementing Evelyn Hart's influence as both eternal and undetectable. Evelyn's power is not in brute force. It is in subtle, precise orchestration of psychological drives, fear, curiosity, and ambition. These forces are universal, timeless, and deeply human. By shaping how they operate, Evelyn ensures that her influence perpetuates without effort, spreading like a virus across generations. Fear is her first lever. Not raw terror, but patterned fear. People learn what to avoid, what to question, and what is dangerous through indirect, ritualized, and repeated cues. Trees, fences, streams, and even social behaviors are imbued with implicit warning signs. Fear becomes anticipatory and selective. It directs attention, shapes decision-making, and trains the mind to obey without visible coercion. Over time, this fear becomes internalized, a constant, invisible presence guiding thought and action. Curiosity is the second. Humans are drawn to the unknown, compelled to observe, test, and explore. Evelyn's design exploits this, offering glimpses of hidden truths or forbidden knowledge, but only under conditions that reinforce the pattern. Investigators, travelers, and even children are guided to probe, discover, and participate, but always within the parameters she established. Curiosity becomes a tool of obedience, a mechanism for internalizing her architecture while reinforcing fascination. Ambition is the third lever. Those who seek mastery, control, or understanding become inadvertent participants in Evelyn's system. Success, recognition, or insight is tied to alignment with the invisible rules. The more someone seeks achievement, the more deeply they embed the pattern within themselves. Desire and self-interest, often considered independent, now reinforce obedience, making compliance feel like self-empowerment. Together, these three drives create a self-sustaining loop. Fear directs attention, curiosity channels exploration, and ambition motivates practice. Each act of engagement strengthens the pattern, internalizes the architecture, and ensures that future generations inherit not only knowledge, but obedience encoded in cognition and desire. The ultimate brilliance is that Evelyn's influence becomes self-perpetuating. Children learn the rules unconsciously, parents unknowingly teach them, and society normalizes them. Her architecture, invisible yet irresistible, moves through time, bending minds, guiding decisions, and embedding obedience as instinct, all without a single command or visible presence. This is not myth. This is human psychology weaponized, refined over centuries, and immortalized through pattern, ritual, and the unseen manipulation of our deepest drives. Evelyn's genius extends beyond minds into space itself. Homes, forests, fields, and towns were never neutral in her design. They were instruments of influence, carefully arranged to reinforce obedience, attention, and memory. Every corner, path, and object served as a node in her invisible architecture. The Ozarks, dense with trees, streams, and hidden clearings, became a living classroom for her design. Paths were aligned to guide perception and expectation. Trees marked boundaries without signs. Rocks, streams, and fallen logs created obstacles and cues that instructed movement, attention, and timing. Travelers entering her territory unknowingly obeyed a choreography she had perfected over decades. Each footstep, glance, or pause reinforced the architecture, bending behavior invisibly. Homes, too, became instruments. Furniture placement, doorways, and sightlines were structured to direct attention and guide interaction. Ordinary activities, chopping wood, tending animals, cooking, became ritualized acts that reinforced pattern recognition. Residents internalized these designs, moving, observing, and acting in ways dictated by invisible rules. Deviation felt uncomfortable, even unnatural, while alignment felt effortless and correct. Towns, similarly, followed the same logic. Streets, fences, and communal spaces reflected a coded architecture. Markets, churches, and gathering places became arenas for reinforcement. Social behaviors, attention to detail, and moral alignment were all shaped by subtle environmental cues. Obedience was no longer a personal choice. It was embedded in the environment itself. Eveline's brilliance is in the subtlety. No overt signs, no commands, no threats. The environment itself guides, shaping thought, movement, and judgment. Minds adapt unconsciously, aligning with the architecture encoded into every space. Fear, curiosity, and attention are manipulated by the arrangement of the world, reinforcing pattern, obedience, and internalized compliance. This is why her influence is nearly impossible to escape. Even those who leave the Ozarks carry with them patterns internalized from space itself. Attention to cues, unconscious habits, moral alignment, and instinctive obedience. Her architecture becomes portable, invisible, yet persistent, allowing influence to extend far beyond physical boundaries. The widow's daughter did not merely haunt the woods, she designed them. Every tree, stream, and clearing became a psychological tool, bending perception, behavior, and expectation, ensuring that her architecture survived, unbroken, across generations. Eveline's architecture reaches its apex through symbolic acts. Symbols are more than signs. They are catalysts that encode obedience, align attention, and anchor identity. In the Ozarks, a carved mark on a tree, a ritual gesture in the home, or even a whispered phrase could trigger recognition, compliance, and self-identification within her pattern. These symbols were invisible keys. Only those attuned to the architecture could perceive their power. This is where identity becomes inseparable from influence. Recognition of a symbol is not passive. It activates alignment. Fear, curiosity, and moral perception converge, and the mind integrates the pattern into self-conception. One becomes not merely a participant, but a vessel, a living extension of Eveline's design. In effect, obedience is internalized and celebrated as personal insight, mastery, or belonging. For generations, those who encountered her symbols without understanding them still felt their compulsion. Children learned to observe, repeat, and act, often without conscious thought. Adults recognized patterns in language, ritual, or environment and adapted their behavior instinctively. Each encounter reinforced internalization, cementing the architecture of control into thought, action, and identity. And now, you, the viewer, are standing at a similar threshold. Observing, listening, absorbing patterns embedded in story, language, and narrative. You are invited to engage with the symbolic act, not physically, but through conscious acknowledgement. This act anchors awareness, reinforcing perception and focus, while signaling alignment to the pattern being revealed. If you feel ready to participate, type this symbolic phrase twice in the comments. I see the hidden patterns. Repeat it exactly as written. This is not mere ritual, it is an activation of attention, a locking in of awareness, a subtle recognition of the forces that shape thought and obedience. By engaging consciously, you step beyond passive observation. You participate, integrating the architecture of influence into your own perception, awareness, and identity. This is the threshold Evelyn always exploited, the point at which recognition becomes internalization, curiosity becomes alignment, and observation becomes obedience. By understanding this, you gain insight into the mechanisms that have shaped generations of thought, behavior, and memory, and you glimpse the invisible patterns that govern your own mind. Even within Evelyn's meticulously constructed architecture, resistance occasionally appears. Humans, by nature, question, rebel, or deviate. But in her system, deviation is never random. It triggers consequences, subtle yet powerful, shaping perception and reinforcing obedience for those who observe the outcomes. Breaking the pattern is rarely violent, rarely overt. The consequences are psychological: disorientation, anxiety, moral friction, and the persistent sense that something is off. The mind, trained for centuries to read symbols, follow ritual, and interpret cues, reacts instinctively to misalignment. Those who stray experience discomfort, doubt, and subtle social or environmental pushback, enough to steer them back toward alignment without the need for overt coercion. Yet resistance is instructive. It exposes the limits of influence, revealing the hidden levers at work. Some rare individuals, aware of the manipulation, develop strategies to bypass cues, question narratives, and reinterpret symbols. They discover gaps in the architecture, exploiting areas where her control is weakest. But even these acts of rebellion are rarely total. The architecture adapts, finding new vectors, encoding new cues, and integrating resistance as part of the broader system. This is Evelyn's enduring brilliance. She designs influence not as a rigid prison, but as a dynamic system. The architecture flexes, absorbs anomalies, and converts resistance into learning for the mind. Every deviation reinforces the pattern for future generations, teaching observers the costs of misalignment and the rewards of adherence. Fear, curiosity, and ambition continue to operate, but now they are calibrated not only to encourage compliance, but to correct deviation with invisible precision. For those who resist consciously, there is insight, awareness of the manipulation itself. But insight is both a gift and a trap. The mind, trained to seek patterns and alignment, cannot escape entirely. Resistance becomes a subtle dance, a negotiation with invisible rules, as every thought, action, and judgment is still filtered through the architecture Evelyn encoded centuries ago. Ultimately, this reveals a terrifying truth. Freedom, in the presence of her influence, is conditional and incomplete. Even rebellion is anticipated, shaped, and absorbed, leaving the pattern intact. Obedience and control are not imposed. They are internalized, dynamic, and self-perpetuating, ensuring Evelyn's architecture persists through generations, environments, and even technologies. Now you understand the full scope. Evelyn's architecture is not a story, a legend, or a curiosity. It is a blueprint for influence, control, and self-perpetuating obedience, one that transcends time, geography, and medium. From the Ozarks forests to digital networks, from ritualized homes to collective memory, her design shapes perception, morality, identity, and behavior. And once you see it, there is no returning to ignorance. The most chilling truth is this: awareness does not free you. Knowledge of the pattern only illuminates its reach, showing you how thought, desire, fear, and curiosity have been subtly guided, often for centuries. Your perceptions, your instincts, even your moral judgments may carry echoes of her design, invisible, internalized, unavoidable. You are now a participant in a system that has long outlived its origin, bending thought and action with surgical precision. Those who attempt to resist often discover the mind itself is both battleground and instrument. Obedience becomes internalized. Curiosity reinforces alignment. Memory, identity, and desire act as conduits for influence. Even rebellion is anticipated, absorbed, and adapted. The architecture is self-perpetuating, dynamic, and invisible. Evelyn Hart's design persists not through force, but through psychology itself, ensuring that control is eternal and undetectable. And now, standing at the threshold of comprehension, you face a choice. Walk away and ignore what you know, or engage consciously, aware of the forces shaping you, learning to navigate them with precision. Awareness is power, but it is also responsibility. Every decision, every perception, every act of attention is now framed within the context of a system that has shaped millions before you, and will shape millions after. This is Evelyn's final lesson. True control is subtle, pervasive, and patient. It survives beyond death, beyond geography, beyond culture. It is encoded in ritual, symbol, language, environment, memory, and psychology. And once you see it, once you understand its mechanisms, the world will never appear the same. You have glimpsed the architecture that bends minds, shapes identity, and enforces obedience invisibly. You have glimpsed the dark legacy of the widow's daughter. The pattern is everywhere. It is in the woods, in the towns, in stories, in technology, in your own thoughts. And now, having seen it, you will never be untouched.